Alright, hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Spray and Pray 1000's The Verdict. I am Spray and Pray 1000 and today we are going to talk about Resident Evil Village. Now, Resident Evil Village is a first-person survival horror game. It's the latest in a long line of Resident Evil games. To even begin to go over most of them would probably take us a long time because this series has been running. At this point, this is actually the 25th anniversary of the series. I think it started in mid 1996, and here we are in 2021 with the latest iteration of the game. Now, to summarize Resident Evil 8 very well, it's basically similar in the same vein of Resident Evil 7, which was a first-person survival horror game. It's not like the fixed camera angles of the original series, nor is it more like the third-person action-oriented variants of the later games that came out during the PS2 and the 360 era. Resident Evil 8 is going more back to traditional survival horror roots by putting you directly inside of Ethan Winters once again. Ethan, since the last game, has moved. He's settled down with his family. He has a baby daughter. And him and Mia have just tried to move on with their lives when, of course, in busts Chris Redfield, murdering Mia, taking away his daughter, and actually abducting Ethan himself, before finally Ethan breaks free and starts to look around a village as he's being taken away for his daughter. And Resident Evil 8, to summarize it really heavily, draws a lot from Resident Evil 4. I think that's not even something that they tried to hide. They directly attributed it, I think partly because they want to reuse some assets for it for Resident Evil 4, which isn't necessarily a bad idea. I won't complain about it. However, Resident Evil 8's biggest strength, right off the bat that you could tell, is just how gorgeous this game looks. This game looks really good. I played it on the PS5. The load times are amazing. The gameplay looks really good. All the characters have a lot of detail. The enemies are really good looking. And, usually I don't like to talk about graphics a ton. At this point, we've kind of praised graphics, to death in a lot of games, and it's very rare that a game really wows me with graphics anymore. But Resident Evil 8 did a really good job. Once again, the lighting in this engine that they use for Resident Evil games is stupendous. And it was the same way in Resident Evil 3 last year, and it's the same it was the same, I'm sorry, in Resident Evil 2 the year before that, and it was the same in Resident Evil 7, I think at this point, in 2017 was Resident Evil 1 or Resident Evil 7. So this engine still holds up, in my opinion. They've definitely made sure that it still looks good. Now, is it as visually wowing as it was way back then? Maybe not so much, but I think the lighting still definitely brings out some of the best. It allows for some cool jump scares. It really adds to a survival horror element, and I think that's one of the strengths of this game by far, is that it really plays into that on a high level. Now, the gameplay of Resident Evil 8 is more or less very similar to Resident Evil 7. You have a more traditional inventory system this time around, where it's like Resident Evil 4, where you have to manage things in your inventory and make space and everything. However, because the game isn't necessarily as long as Resident Evil 4, and there's definitely other elements at play, like simplifying what you do need to carry and not having as many weapons and everything. You don't actually end up having as much of a hardcore menu simulator as Resident Evil 4, but that might just be for the game's benefit. It keeps the game fast-paced and flowing, which is something that, it doesn't necessarily bog down Resident Evil 4, but it definitely is something I will say is a real factor of Resident Evil 4. There might actually be times where you need to take a minute or two just to organize your inventory to figure stuff out. It's not that that's necessarily a super big negative in 4, nor is it a super positive in this game, but you won't be doing as much menuing as you might have recalled doing a decade ago. A lot of this is definitely throwbacks to it. The gunplay of Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4, yeah. I mean, it was good, wasn't it? You could never really get rid of it. I mean, it inspired a whole generation of third-person shooters. But on topic, the gunplay of Resident Evil 8 is fairly straightforward. You have a gun, you aim in, you shoot said gun, and that's pretty much where it ends. Now on the PS5, because of haptic feedback, the controller will try to simulate like resistance on the triggers. I'm actually not really a fan of haptic feedback. It's a cool thing. Like, I definitely think at some moments during the gameplay, it definitely made things a little more tense because you also have to kind of fight the resistance in the controllers. I'm not a fan of it, though. I just don't really prefer having buttons pushed back. You know, that just feels weird to me. That's just me personally. You know, that's whatever. You might like it. I kind of don't. And I do think that there's a decent amount of weapon variety. There's no like machine gun in this game at all, like no pistol. I'm not really sure why. That's just a common class of weapons that usually is in a Resident Evil game that isn't. But for the most part, you spend most of your time roaming around different areas in the game. There's treasures to find, like hidden on the walls or hidden in different places. You could go, more or less like soft roam around areas. Of course, they bring back roaming enemies similar to Jack Baker in Resident Evil 7, who basically their job is to provide pressure against you to kind of stalk you and make you feel weak, and you can't really defeat them right away. And other than that, it's more of your typical like survival horror style game where your whole goal is to find a series of key items that lead you from one important fight to the next. Which is totally fine, actually. I really kind of like that gameplay. In fact, I always like seeing it be remixed. And honestly, Capcom proves that they still have it after all these years, you know, giving the Resident Evil franchise this much-needed soft reboot and more serious take after the almost action movie feel of Resident Evil 6 is definitely a breath of fresh air for this franchise. Going back to its roots definitely worked out for the best in almost every aspect for Resident Evil, between either the remakes of the last 2 years or the new games from this year and 2017. I think it really did work out and plays to the strengths of Resident Evil to be able to do that. And so, other than that, I think that Resident Evil has a lot of good stuff going for it. You're going to get your money's worth out of this game. I feel like definitely if you could buy this game, you're going to get your money's worth out of it because it's a very fun and enjoyable game. You essentially spend most of it, if you're really getting the horror mindset, the horror mood, it's definitely a game meant to be played in a certain type of atmosphere. But what you're going to get out of it is going to be several hours of hardcore gameplay. You know, there's definitely a lot of jumping at shadows and other things like that. The noises and the sounds are really well done. Obviously, everyone knows about Vampire Lady. Definitely, elements of this game are really enjoyable. Just for either, you know, scare factor or just for the fun, action-packed shooting factor as well. Now, the story of Resident Evil 8, like I said, Ethan Winters gets abducted alongside his daughter, and it's supposedly by Chris Redfield, who is an old friend of Ethan's. Now, they have basically completely ditched the Redfield from Resident Evil 7. They essentially have, they don't talk about it. It didn't happen. So this time around, you're back to what you would expect Chris Redfield to look like at this point in the timeline, I'd say. And basically, there's a lot of twists and turns in this plot. And I can't even really begin to talk about it without spoiling it. And as you normally know, I don't like to spoil games in my verdicts. So what I will say is that if you are a fan of the Resident Evil lore, I was very skeptical of this game, right? When it first was announced, I was like, man, do I want to play as Ethan Winters again? You know, I don't really know if this is the type of game for me. The gameplay, you know, wasn't really like that amazing from 7 that I was like super hyped to go play it again. And ultimately, I ended up buying this game because Capcom hasn't really screwed me over other than Resident Evil 3 Remake in past years. And boy, I really think that this is one of the best games I've played out of Capcom in a while. So I will say that if you are on the fence, if you're skeptical, if you're a Resident Evil fan, this is the game for you. This is a game that's perfect to jump in. You'll have a good time. The story is definitely very satisfying, you know, especially when you consider how long this series has been running. You know, I think we a lot of series, when they run for a long time, a lot of people begin to feel like this story has kind of jumped the shark. It's not the same. It's not as good. I feel like that already happened with Resident Evil, and what we have now is actually like a really, really good portion of events. Like, there's a lot of good stuff that happens in this game, a lot of twists and turns, ways to connect it to older Resident Evil games, and I really think that Capcom made this game with that distinctly in mind, and to them I give a lot of credit, because that is awesome. It means that this game has a lot of love for the fans. There's a lot of throwbacks to things from previous Resident Evil games, and that's what you want to see, right? You want to see, like, the new series does things different, but also, you know, doesn't abandon its roots. And that's one thing that I do like about Resident Evil Village, and it's arguably my favorite part of Resident Evil Village. Is the story. I think that without the story being as strong as it was, this would have just been kind of another okay game and stuff. But boy, was I wrong. I thought the story of this game was absolutely amazing, especially once you get to the end and you get all the nice revelations and everything. Mwah, it's beautiful. It's a chef's kiss. I love it. And that said, there's not really too much for me to say about it, and I really kind of hate this, because I know that the last verdict I did, which was Assassin's Creed Valhalla, was basically like 7 hours. It was the 7th verdict I did. That's why it's basically 1 full hour of, like, major points that I think the game did right, but not that well, and basically elaborating on all that. I think, because I don't really have anything negative to say about Resident Evil Village, there's not really much to talk about. I think the game is a good, solid survival horror experience. I think it's true to the idea of a survival horror game, and there's a lot of new changes to the gameplay systems and everything. So when you guard now, you can kick back enemies if they hit you. They made healing a bit better. They made a couple of different things easier to pull off. There's still a lot of action-y sequences as well, and I gotta respect the fact that they varied it. You know, there's actually, like, a good amount of gameplay in this game. There's optional things to do, optional areas on the map that you can find. You can go hunting for animals. It's not as, like, ridiculously in-depth as you think. They just spawn in a certain area and you can chase them down. But, like, the fact that they have these optional things also lends to the whole replayability of it. There's a new game plus. There's a mercenaries mode, like usual. I say like usual, it hasn't been around for a while, but there's a mercenaries mode where you can do extra stuff and you can run around and gain points and craft things. I think that's one of the cool things about Resident Evil, is that after so many years, they're still finding a way to keep the formula evolving and changing. So ultimately, what would I give Resident Evil Village? Well, I think that the one thing I would say is that maybe the game would benefit if it had, like, maybe one more area, or if it had maybe just a couple extra things. But for the most part, it's a good, solid, very standard survival horror game. Definitely more enjoyable than Resident Evil Village. I'm sorry, Resident Evil Biohazard from I was gonna say, like, yesteryear or something. But what would I give Resident Evil Village? I'm gonna give Resident Evil Village a 95 out of 100, and the reason why is because thoroughly I enjoyed this game. Whether it was the crisp graphics of the game, whether it was the survival horror elements of the game, or just in general, just sort of like running around and having it was fun. I mean, I really think that that's all I need to say about it. I thoroughly enjoyed it from both a story and a gameplay aspect, and because of that, it's one of my favorite playthroughs I've done in a while. It's one of my favorite games that I've played, and I think that it really earned the high ranking that it got. Now, where we go from here, I'm not sure. But Resident Evil Village definitely was a banger for me. I highly recommend that you buy this game and check it out. I'm SprayingPray1000. Thank you for joining me on The Verdict today, and I hopefully will see you next time.